Well, welcome to the Royal Economic Society Hahn Lecture. The eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed that I'm not Nick Crafts. I'm afraid he's indisposed and will not be able to join us this afternoon. I'm Jagjit Chadha, the Director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and I'm delighted to welcome you as well to Glasgow, one of my favourite cities. And I've never seen the sun shine here before, so it's absolutely wonderful, doubly wonderful to be here on this day. Just before introducing our wonderful speaker, I just want to remind you about the Royal Economic Society Code of Conduct, which I think will appear on the screen in a minute. No clasping, no gouging, no tackles below the waist or anything like that. We'll have questions reserved for the end of Professor Bustan's lecture. We've got 4 roving mics, and I want to thank the volunteers for the conference and this lecture and giving their time so wonderfully to help us run this thing. Thank you very much, volunteers. But please wait for the mic to come to you. This is also being live streamed, so do remember that when you make your comments. And it's being recorded. I believe will end up on the Royal Economic Society website in the next day or two. Now, I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome Leah Bustan to the Royal Economic Society to give the Hahn Lecture. And before doing that, I just want to say a couple of words about Frank Hahn. Frank Hahn died 10 years ago this year, and this lecture is in his honour. Born in 1925, died in 2013, and he was president of this society from 1986 to 1989. And himself, his own life, I think, is something of a story which provides an analogue to Leah Bustan's work. He was born in Berlin, moved to Prague with his family in 1931, and then moved to England in 1938, first settling in Bournemouth, before embarking on a remarkable career in general equilibrium and monetary economics. I first came across him when I moved to Cambridge in the late 1990s. And for people of my generation, we also remember that he was one of the instigators of the famous letter in 1981 announcing that the Chancellor's policies would prevent a recovery were they not reversed. And some 364 economists signed that letter, one of whom latterly became Governor of the Bank of England, Mervyn King. There's a very interesting historiography about the impact of that letter and open letters in general, but I'll leave that for another day, if I may. Leah Bustan is Professor of Economics at Princeton University, where she is also Director of the Industrial Relations section. Her research lies in an incredibly interesting area. It's the intersection between economic history and labour economics. Her first book, Competition: The Promised Land, in 2016, examined the effect of the great black migration from the rural South after World War II. Her more recent work, which includes a new book called Streets of Gold, looks at the mass migration from Europe to the United States in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Leah is co-director of the development of the American Economy Program at the MBER, and she also is a co-editor of the American Economic Journal, Applied Economics. Leah was named as Alfred P. Sloan Research Fellow in 2012. Gives me great pleasure on this day and at this moment when migration continues to be a very important topic in this country and around the world as we try to confront the issues that have led to it. And I look forward very much to listening to Leah's work in the next 45 minutes. Leah Bustan, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jagjit, for the introduction, and to the organizers of the conference for the invitation to be here. I am so honored to be with you today. I'd like to share some findings from my new book, Streets of Gold, subtitled America's Untold Story of Immigrant Success. But the book has already been out now for almost a year, so I'd like to start by summarizing the key findings, but then move on to some new work that I've been pursuing with my longtime collaborator, Ron Abramitsky at Stanford. We chose to write this book because we believed that, at least in the American context, Our national conversation about immigration policy has been driven largely by myths and anecdotes rather than by data and facts. And one of these myths is what inspired the title of our book, Streets of Gold. Perhaps you've heard of this idea that anyone can come to America and make it there very quickly on their own, but the reality might be a lot more complex. If you visited the Ellis Island Museum in New York Harbor, you'll see painted on the wall there this quotation attributed to an unnamed Italian immigrant. And he said, "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out 3 things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them." So the reality of the immigrant experience, both then and now, might be a lot more like the expression of this unnamed immigrant. And our goal is to move beyond the immigrants who are listed on the front page of the newspapers and make the headlines, either because they are great entrepreneurs or CEOs, or because they are criminals whose exploits make it to the front page. What if instead we were able to collect data on the millions of unnamed immigrants and their families, and we used their experiences to rebuild the story of immigration to America from the ground up? So what Ron and I have done is exactly that. We've put together the first large panel data sets following immigrants as they arrive in the country and spend more time in the US, as well as following their children from childhood households to the labor market. In order to do this, we started 15 years ago on Ancestry.com, which is the genealogy website, and we started by looking up a few hundred families by hand. And then we got a bit greedy, and we programmed a web scraper to start to download data on thousands of families, until Ron got a cease and desist call from the Ancestry lawyers saying, "Mr. Abramitsky, it looks like you have a really big family." It turns out that their web traffic had increased 30%, and those had come only from a few accounts at UCLA and Stanford. So we've since built up a research partnership with Ancestry, and they provide the digitized census data sets through the Minnesota Population Center. And what we've added are algorithms to link individuals across census waves. I'm showing you one census manuscript in a PDF form. It's not that we use data in this form. Our data are coming from digitized data sets. But I wanted to show you one not at all randomly selected immigrant family, and that's my own family, living in Chicago in 1920. So you see Hyman Platt there. He's my great-grandfather, living with his wife and his 8 children in Chicago, with the second to youngest being his child, Matthew Platt, my grandfather. And I show this because my family ends up reflecting the larger patterns that we find both in the early 20th century and today. And that is that the first generation, the immigrants themselves, move up the economic ladder slowly. But it's the second generation, the children of immigrants, who rise, and they rise to the same extent now as they did in the past. So in the book, we reassess 4 major immigration myths. And I will go into only one of these today so that I can reserve time for some new material. But just to summarize, is it really true that we're facing an unprecedented flood of immigration to the US today? And the answer is no. We've seen immigration as the same share of the population during the Ellis Island generation in the late 19th, early 20th century as we do today. Is it true that the Ellis Island immigrants from Europe rose quickly from rags to riches, but immigrants today are not as successful? Again, the answer is no. In both periods, we see the first generation moving up slowly. The major difference between past and present simply is the earnings of immigrants upon first arrival. Historically, immigrants came from European countries that were not that different from the US in terms of level of development. And so while immigrants faced an earnings gap of around 10% relative to the US born, today that gap is much larger, more on the order of 30% on average. So the pace of upward mobility is the same, but the initial gaps are different. That has led some people to ask, well, perhaps then the children of immigrants will remain behind today. And I'll show you that that's not the case. And finally, in the book, we also have a section on cultural assimilation, where we try to collect as many outcomes that we can compare past and present to look at the pace of cultural integration. And we find a very similar pace today and in the past in terms of who do immigrants marry, what neighborhoods do they live in, and even the names that they give for their children, and as they spend time in the US, shifting towards more American-sounding names. So the story is really quite an optimistic one, and the way we summarize it is that the American dream is just as alive today as it was 100 years ago. Many have asked us, do these findings also apply in the UK and in the EU? And this we don't know yet, and we hope to explore in coming years. So if any of you listening are working on something along these lines, especially related to the second generation, please come find me at the drinks hour and we should talk. But what I want to spend most of my time on today is, as I said, the story is an optimistic one, and it turns out that this is reflected in the attitudes that Americans express towards immigration. Despite what you might hear when listening to anti-immigrant politicians, attitudes today are more positive than at any time in US history. And we have taken attitudinal measures back 150 years, and I'll explain how. And in fact, relative to the past 150 years, we have more positive attitudes today than in the past. But of course, they're increasingly polarized by political party, and so we want to get inside the data to see what explains this polarization. So before I get to attitudes, I'm going to show you a few facts from the book to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I do usually speak to audiences in the US. So here I want to show you the share of the US population that was born abroad. Going back to 1850, which is the first time that the census asked about place of birth, and forward till today. And so here you can see the fact that I started with, that the share of the population that's foreign-born today is of quite the same magnitude as it had been during the Ellis Island era. Around 14 to 15% of the population today is born abroad, and as well in the past. But what's changed is the countries or regions of origin of the immigrant stock. So the yellow section reflects a set of European countries, the red section reflects the Americas, and the blue section reflects Asia. So historically, you can see that 90% of the immigrant stock came from European countries, with Ireland first, the largest sending country, then Germany. And the red section, historically, coming from the Americas, almost entirely from Canada. Today, a much more diverse set of immigrants in the immigrant stock, coming from the Americas, Asia, and the rest of the world. Because of this diverse set of sending countries, immigrants do arrive with a larger earnings gap today. So the concern has been that, as a result, we might see that the second generation remains behind. But what I will show you is that children of immigrants today experience rapid social mobility. It's in fact the same pace of upward mobility now as in the past. And this is true even for the children of immigrants from very poor sending countries. What I'm going to show you today are the patterns for children who are raised at the 25th percentile of the income distribution. The modern data of course, does not come from linked historical census records. Instead, we have to thank the Opportunity Insights Lab at Harvard, who provided this data for us. The underlying data comes from the IRS tax records, with children linked to parents using Social Security number, and the fact that children are reported on their parents' tax form as a tax dependent, and then can be followed later in life to the labor market. So what you're seeing here is a whole lot of information and a lot of dots, so let me unpack it for you. This is the modern data to begin with, and then I will show you the historical data. Right now, I'm showing you a pattern for the sons of immigrants. And this is very important in a minute, and I'll just allude to one major difference with daughters. So the first thing you can see is the magenta dot that's all the way to the left-hand side of the picture. Can everyone see it? That is the children of white US-born fathers who were raised at the 25th percentile. And then in adulthood, reach on average the 46th percentile of the income distribution. And then you can see the peach dots, most of them to the right of that magenta dot, reflecting the sons of immigrants from all over the world. There were 51 countries that the IRS was willing to release to us with this aggregate data. And on average, the children of immigrant fathers who were raised at the 25th percentile are reaching the 51st percentile in adulthood. The second thing you can see, and you may not be able to read the individual countries so easily, but I'll point to the middle part of the picture where you can see that the children of fathers from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua are themselves right in the middle of the pack of the children of immigrants. So even those children whose parents are coming from Central American countries, which are very much in the news and in the policy discussion in the US today, are able to achieve rapid upward mobility. The final thing is that there's quite a lot of interesting dispersion across countries of origin for the parents, so that the children of Asian parents who were raised at the 25th percentile are reaching on average the 60th, and the children here, the sons of parents from the Caribbean, from Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, and Jamaica, are reaching only the 44th percentile. Now, right off the bat, if I were to click on the link that said daughters there, which I won't here in the lecture, you'll see that the pattern looks very similar for daughters, except for the daughters of families from the Caribbean. Unlike the sons, who are at the bottom of this picture, the daughters are in the middle or even above average. And so the story that's going on here is not a story only of the race of the immigrant family or even the region of origin, but it also has an interesting intersection with gender. So let me turn to a similar picture that we were able to put together historically. And this comes from two cohorts of linked census data. On the left-hand side, you have boys who were at home in 1880 and in the labor market in 1910, and on the right-hand side, boys who were at home in 1910 around the time that my grandfather was at home and in the labor market in 1940. And we see very similar pattern where the sons of white US-born fathers are to the left, achieving some upward mobility, but the faster pace of upward mobility is for the sons of immigrant fathers, especially those countries like Italy, Ireland, Portugal, and Russia that were pointed to by politicians at the time, and politicians at the time said these are groups that would never assimilate into the American economy. So with the historical data, we have much more information at the micro level for each of these households to give you a sense of the underlying mechanisms. Remember, for the modern data, we just have those aggregates produced by the IRS. And it turns out that much of what we're finding historically in terms of an upward mobility advantage for the children of immigrants is due to geography. Immigrant parents more so than US-born parents, moved to those locations in the US that provided upward mobility for all. At the time, in 1910 or 20, the one local factor that correlates most strongly with upward mobility is the density of manufacturing jobs. And those were the types of areas that attracted immigrants and then provided upward mobility for all children. And so I can show you this pattern by including a few sets of geographic fixed effects. So on the very left-hand side of the panel, you'll see an uncontrolled gap in rank points between children who were raised at the 25th percentile with an immigrant parent versus a US-born parent. And that's the 6 rank points that we've been talking about. So the 46th versus the 51st or 52nd point in the income distribution. Now the second bar immediately to the right just controls for one indicator. Did you live in the US South? And immigrants avoided the South, which at the time was an agricultural region, primarily cotton growing, with very low upward mobility for both Black and white Americans. At the time, 15% of the population was foreign-born, and only 2% of the Southern population was foreign-born. And the second factor that makes a big difference, which you can see as you scroll all the way over to the right-hand side of the picture, is controlling for an indicator for do you live in an urban area or not. Immigrants were more likely to move to cities, and the US-born were more likely to be in rural areas. So when you compare 2 households in the same county, one whose father was foreign-born, one US-born, there's actually no remaining immigrant advantage. And for US-born households where the father is living out of his state of birth, so an indicator of some form of internal mobility, you see that those children look more like the children of immigrants. Now, I don't know whether the same mechanisms are at play in the modern data. I suspect that the story might be more complicated, and I'm looking forward to figuring out how to work on this question given the data availability. But this is a very optimistic story. So let me turn then to attitudes. Attitudes towards immigrants are more positive today than at any point in US history. And if you look at public opinion polls, which go back in a thick sense until around the year 2000, you see that attitudes are trending upward towards more positive views. 75% of respondents today say that immigration is good for the country. We can't go much further back than that with surveys. And so what we've done is classify speeches in the congressional record from 1870 to 2020 on 2 dimensions to look at political attitudes expressed by representatives. First, is this speech immigration related or not? And we have identified 200,000 speeches out of around 8 million that are related to immigration. And secondly, in that speech about immigration, is the attitude expressed pro, neutral, or anti? This is joint work with Ron, as always, but also with a series of co-authors, including linguists and computer scientists at Stanford. To give you a sense of what words pop out from our classifier as pro or anti-immigration in different points in history, you can see early on the word that's most important in predicting being anti-immigration is the word Chinese. Early on, the US had a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in 1882. Words associated with being pro-immigration are words like agriculture or industrious. Today, you see words like terrorism or illegal associated with being classified as an anti-immigration speech, and words like community and contribution associated with being a pro-immigration speech, as well as, quite interestingly, words like heritage and Irish. So there's implicitly a sort of historical comparison going on in some of these pro-immigration speeches. So let me show you what pops out of our classifier, showing you a full time series of attitudes towards immigration with the blue line reflecting Democrats and the red line reflecting Republicans. Now, throughout the full 140 years, 40% of the data is neutral by our classifier. So what I'm graphing here is the percent of speeches in a given year that are pro minus the percent that are anti. And historically, this number is around -40, so around 10% of speeches being pro and around 50% being anti. And that's true from 1880 to 1945. During this period, Congress attempted to close the border to immigration 4 times. And they were only successful in 1921, overriding a presidential veto. That means they had a supermajority, or over 66% voting to close the border. But you don't see any run-up in negative attitudes leading to that legislation. In fact, there was a consistent and steady drumbeat of anti-immigrant sentiment before 1945. Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, with the offensive statement expressed here, is one of the architects of this border closure legislation. And if we compare Senator Lodge to the mean, he actually lies right on the mean. So he's not particularly anti relative to the average. From 1945 to 1965, during that 20-year period, you see the average increasing in the pro-immigration direction in only a generation. And the historical narrative suggests that this is not a grassroots change. In fact, this is a top-down change that was designed originally by President Harry Truman in response to early Cold War and anti-US Soviet propaganda, saying that the US claims to be so meritocratic, but yet has racist immigration policy. The border closure that I alluded to was not across the board reductions in immigration, but was targeted so that there were certain quota slots allocated to Italians, certain quota slots allocated to Poles, and those numbers were quite small relative to the allocation for Brits, for example. And so President Truman wanted to take away that talking point on the part of the Soviets and was ultimately successful in converting the political class at least. In 1965, the US border reopens to immigration, and since that point, the polarization that we now are quite familiar with begins. So you see the Democrats, the blue line, pulling away from the red Republican line from 1965 onward. Quite interestingly, underlying these means are a whole set of individual representatives, and at least for those representatives who gave 20 or more speeches about immigration in a given year, I'm illustrating the individual data here. And I especially want you to focus on the 1965 and after period, the period of polarization. In the 80s and in the 2000s, you see that despite the fact that the averages are pulling apart, there are still a number of Democrats who themselves individually are more likely to have anti than pro speeches, and a number of Republicans who are more likely to have pro rather than anti speeches. So there was scope for bipartisan action, at least amongst those who are most ardent about immigration and speak about it regularly. The Trump administration, which is the very last red section at the end from 2017 onward, is the one period where we've had complete separation, and the most anti-Democrat is more pro than the most pro-Republican, with one exception. So finally, we wanted to understand descriptively what's underlying this polarization. And so we classified these speeches in terms of underlying topic. And what I'm illustrating here are the 14 topics that popped out of this process of measuring what my linguist and computer scientist colleagues call frames. There's a lot in this picture. So on the left-hand side, you have a historical comparison between Republicans and Democrats, and on the right-hand side, you have a modern comparison. If you scale along the x-axis in one direction or the other, you can see the frequency ratio. So how often is this topic mentioned by one party or another? And the size of the circle tells you how common this topic is in immigration speeches relative to the rest of the congressional record. And what you can see is that historically, the two parties are lying on top of each other in terms of topic, and today the topics are quite different, with Republicans often referring to crime and legal issues in speeches about immigration, and Democrats speaking about victims, i.e. persecution and refugees, as well as family and contribution. But what really fascinated me is that there's no difference between Republicans and Democrats and how often they speak of labor issues or economic issues, which is our frame that captures fiscal and tax and budgetary concerns. So this summer, we're going to be diving into these frames in more detail because it could be that the labor topics that Republicans discuss and the labor topics the Democrats discuss are quite different. But for right now, we see no difference in these frequencies. And in fact, what's going on is that Republicans are speaking much more readily about crime and the link between immigration and crime. So for the first time, Ron and I thought, well, I think we're in the wrong discipline. We've been thinking about labor issues, but in fact, in the political sphere, what matters seems to be concerns about immigration and crime. So the final thing I want to share with you are some new results on immigration and incarceration. The question is, has there ever been a time in US history when immigrants are more likely than the US born to be incarcerated? And we're doing this using the census and ACS group quarters question. If you're enumerated in the census as living in a group quarter, it could be a college dorm, it could be a nursing home, or it might be a correctional facility. Historically, we have access to the full count data up through 1940, which is very important given that at the time, incarceration was a very uncommon event. And so to be able to look at incarceration separately by country of origin, it's important to have the full census. And what we find is that indeed there's never been an era in US history when immigrants are more likely to be incarcerated than the white US-born population. And if we were to include the full US-born population, immigrants have always been less likely to be incarcerated. But when we compare to the white US-born population, we see that the two series are lying on top of each other, with the blue series reflecting US-born and the orange immigrants, up until 1960, at which point immigrants now have an incarceration advantage. They're less likely to be incarcerated. And this general pattern holds as we look at a variety of subgroups, but not all. So I'm going to start on this slide with the subgroups where indeed this pattern does hold. That includes Northern and Western Europeans, Southern and Eastern Europeans, which is very important. I wish I could go back to Senator Lodge and tell him that his connection between Southern and Eastern Europeans and organized crime seems not to be showing up in the data, as well as the bottom series, which is Rest of World. Rest of World includes all other countries except China, Mexico, and Central America, which I will show you on the next slide separately. So historically, Rest of World is going to be mostly Canada, and in the modern period, it will include the rest of Latin America, the rest of Asia, the Middle East, and Africa and the Caribbean. So there are these two groups where the pattern is a bit more complex, and we need to understand what's going on both historically and today. For the Chinese, we see from 1870 to 1940, they're more likely to be incarcerated than the white US born, and today much less likely. For Mexicans and Central Americans, we see as well that this group is more likely to be incarcerated up until 1960, at which point the two series lie on top of each other until 2001, where they separate again. And Mexicans and Central Americans are indeed more likely to be incarcerated today. But I will show you a few things that complicate this picture. One is that correctional facilities can include immigration detention facilities. And there's been a vast rise in these detention facilities since 2001. These are individuals who have committed an immigration offense. So they've either overstayed a visa or they have crossed the border illegally, but they have not committed a criminal offense. And criminal offense would, that individual would first be incarcerated in prison or jail, serve out their sentence, and then perhaps go to a detention facility. So we can exclude as much as possible that set. Then I will show you that this gap reverses if we compare Mexicans and Central Americans to the full US population rather than just white US born, and reverses as well when controlling for education. So this is what happens if we exclude the 18 PUMAs, geographic areas, that contain the major ICE detention facilities. And so now I'm just showing you regression coefficients instead of the raw data. So the outcome is an indicator for being incarcerated. The main right-hand side variable is an indicator for being an immigrant, with a sample that includes only Mexican and Central Americans in that immigrant group. And then the black series would replicate the gap between white US born and Mexican and Central American that I showed you on the raw series. And the blue dots would reflect what that gap looks like after excluding those 18 PUMAs. And in doing so, only 3 years after 2001 remain with a statistically significant incarceration gap. Now, if we also control for education fixed effects, which are the orange dots, here it's as if we are comparing white high school dropouts to Mexican and Central Americans who did not receive a high school education or complete a high school degree. And we can see that the gap entirely reverses. So before we've added this education control, the gap is 5 in 1,000 individuals against Mexican and Central Americans. And once we do add that control, it's 20 out of 1,000 individuals in favor of Mexican and Central American individuals. So I don't know what the public is thinking. Are they thinking about the uncontrolled series, just the raw data series, in which case what's most relevant to them would be perhaps this picture here? Or are they also taking into account the fact that immigrants may be drawn from a different educational distribution, in which case the orange series is going to be what's most relevant? Now, to understand why it is that immigrants without a high school degree seem to have a different set of social and economic behaviors than white US born without a high school degree, it turns out that crime is only one such indicator. My final data slide will just show you that if we look at other pro-social activities like labor force participation, the share of the population that's married, or the share reporting excellent or good health, since around 1960 or 70, a gap has opened up in favor of immigrants, here focusing only on men without a high school degree. So immigrants without a high school degree are far more likely to participate in the labor force, more likely to be married, more likely to report excellent or good health, and far less likely to be incarcerated than white US born men without a high school degree. So it seems like crime is just one of a combination of behaviors, and it might be that immigrants are less exposed to some of the economic shocks that underlie this pattern for white US-born high school dropouts. They may be less exposed to trade shocks that particularly hit routine jobs, or they may be more resilient when facing those shocks. And so this is a set of patterns that we had not seen otherwise reported in the literature, and I think they bear some further investigation. So I will conclude by reminding you all that the recent decades, in the US at least, are the first with a large number of pro-immigrant politicians. So while we spend a lot of time thinking about the anti-immigrant politicians, who could indeed be quite loud, in fact, the data suggests that this is the first period where we've had a large number of pro-immigrant politicians. However, the views about immigration are increasingly polarized, and concerns about crime drive much of this anti-immigrant sentiment. And so we ask, might data and evidence sway the middle? And So we check in the data and find that indeed the fears about the connection between immigration and crime do not fit the facts. And this is something that we do hope to bring into the public debate. Here, as well as in our work on second generation upward mobility, comparisons with the UK and the EU are, of course, sorely needed. And please do come find me at drinks if you would like to talk about work in the UK or EU context. I would love to create partnerships so that we could work on these topics together. Thank you so much.
Just wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank Leah for such a wonderful exposition of her work and attention to detail and the data analysis that she's bringing to bear on issues affecting or resulting from immigration. I certainly feel we need to bring some of this work to the attention of our Home Secretary, but let's get on to that a little bit later on. I wonder if I could start with one question, and we'll give everyone time to reflect and come up with their questions as well. Just wondered, one of the things in this country is there's been an increasing number of politicians drawn from immigrant backgrounds. And I wonder if that's the case in the States as well, and might that be driving some of the results that you're getting with a more positive reflection of immigration in debates in Congress? Is that a possibility in your work?
So that is a great question, and in fact, what's going to animate our summer vacation. So my summer vacation plans are to understand those individual differences in representatives. So we've now showed the time series and looked at the mean, but we see there's quite a lot of dispersion around the mean. And one of our hypotheses does relate to the role of second-generation immigrants who may be inspired by their family stories and connect their own family history to the experiences of current immigration. We're working with James Feigenbaum at BU, who has actually linked all of our representatives back to the historical censuses, as long as they were alive in 1940, and sadly many of them were, even today, to find their family history, and then has filled in the more recent representatives as well. So we're going to be able, in a sense, to run a horse race or to try to decompose what's going on into changes in family background, as well as responses to local demographics in your own electorate, and responses to economic shocks in your area. And particularly in explaining the great rise in positive sentiment towards immigrants, might there be a connection to economic growth and World War II economic activity in different locations that might have eased off some of the xenophobic attitudes of the 1920s and 30s?
Thank you, Leah. Well, that's a very promising agenda that you have in front of us. We have 15 minutes or so for questions from the floor. We'll take a couple. So we'll go 1, 2, come on, who's 3? Come on, 3. So we've got that chap at the back there. So wait for the just introduce yourself, ask the question. Yes, you've got to tap it, see if it's on, do the Norman Collier routine.
I'll stand up as well.
Okay, and then we'll pass.
Hi there, my name's Tim Bennett, I'm from Aston University. First of all, thank you, that was an amazing presentation, I really enjoyed it. I have kind of 2 questions that really struck me. So the first was that we saw this amazing upward social mobility from the children of immigrants. But I guess where you have upward social mobility, there must be a counterpart that there are people who are experiencing downward social mobility. And I was wondering sort of what's the profile of the people who are falling down the spectrum, as it were. And the second thing I thought was, that the data that you showed on crime was like, okay, empirically, it's not a thing, but I'm wondering to what extent, does reality really come into it? Because the point is, it's politicians who are driving a narrative, that it comes from speeches that you said, and I'm wondering whether or not actually it's to do with the conditions that have been created by potential downward social mobility, which have created a kind of a fertile bed for lies about crime and everything else. So, I don't know.
Thank you. We'll collect 2 more up as well, and we keep them brief, then we've got time for more questions. Thank you very much for that. We'll just come to the front.
Thank you very much. Tanya Wilson from the University of Glasgow. So one of the things that I was wondering when you put your data up is this is census data. And my understanding from watching The West Wing is that not everyone fills the census in. And specifically what I'm worried about is undocumented illegal immigration, and how you feel, especially within the UK, following what Jadjit said, that there seems to go and be a lot of anti-immigration sentiment towards undocumented or illegal immigrants, what we can learn from that, from your work. Thank you.
Just making note of the questions as we go along. And third question, whoever, volunteer, come on. That's right. Thank you very much. Wonderful.
Hi, Apurav Bhatia from University of Birmingham. So I was thinking on the country of origin of the immigrants as well. So on the graph from the 25th percentile movement for the next generation, a lot of immigrants came from maybe distant countries like India and China. They were more likely to move upward. So maybe it's a bit about it's costly to go back and therefore you're working hard. And similarly on the incarceration rate, maybe the cost today for the migrants to return back to the country are much higher. So they're much more likely to abide by the rules and so on.
Some great observations. This the first round. You can answer them any way that you wish. Yeah.
So on downward mobility, one thing I want to point out that we haven't talked about is what happens at the 75th percentile, for example. And so the IRS created similar points for us at the 25th and at the 75th. And we find there that immigrants are actually very much in line with the US born at the 75th percentile today. So the advantages that the children of immigrants have in upward mobility is moving up from the bottom. But if we're talking about above the median, children of immigrants and children of US born actually converge and lie on top of each other. But I think that politically the concern has always been, what about the bottom? In terms of the political economy of stories about immigrants and crime, I've only recently started to talk about our crime results in public, and what I'll hear is, well, it's all very well and good that on average immigrants don't commit more crimes than the US born, but one crime is too much. And so my tolerance for crime, if it's a US born, a US citizen, is to a certain degree. My tolerance, if it's an immigrant, is down to 0. And so if that's the social welfare function that some people have, not a surprise that stories about immigration and crime are very effective, regardless of the statistical facts. But now that we have this data in place, we can understand a little bit more about the geography of who is telling these stories, what are the underlying local conditions that might encourage these stories. In terms of filling out the census and concerns about representativeness of the data, actually, our concern is much more on the modern data, because in order to enter the modern data, you need to be filing taxes with an official Social Security number. And we're lucky in a certain way that our data is focused on children who are born in 82 and 83, so that there's enough time that they can be in the labor market today. Children who were born in 82 or 83 may have been born to an undocumented family, but 86 was a mass amnesty under President Ronald Reagan, the 1986 IRCA, and we've never had an amnesty of that nature since then. 2.2 million of the 2.7 million undocumented individuals who were in the country as of 1982 then were on a path to citizenship with work papers, and then eventually they could apply for citizenship. So we think that we're lucky that we're actually capturing the majority of immigrants, even in the modern data. However, if we were to imagine going forward to children born in 92 or 93, then we're going to have a lot of sample selection issues in the IRS data. So on the last question, I only was able to hear snippets of it, I have to say. So if you could repeat it, that would be great.
So I was thinking on the country of origin of the immigrants. So in the movement from the 25th percentile to the higher percentile for the next generation, it seemed like the immigrants coming from countries far away are more likely to be on the upper end of the tail. Maybe they are more hardworking, it's much more difficult to go back. And similarly on the incarceration rate, is it the case that the cost for the immigrants are much higher to go back to their country, and that today, so the cost of immigrants to go back to their origin country is much higher today than in the past because of social stigma or something else, and that's why they're more abiding to the rules?
So we've been very hesitant, thank you, to try to interpret the cross-country patterns because we do only have 50 data points, and so it could be distance, and it could be the fact that Asian families at the 25th percentile may arrive with certain education or credentials that is not being represented in their income upon first arrival. And so the parents could be passing on certain kinds of educational advantages. We have not been able to get into the mechanisms in the modern data, and we do hope to do so, but we've heard many theories about what's going on. It's just hard with only 50 data points. And a very important point on incarceration today that given the rise of deportation, given the rise of deportation as a punishment for crimes of an increasingly long list, there is a double penalty that immigrants face today, and that might be, that underlying economic incentive may explain part of why immigrants with even less than a high school degree are much less likely to commit crimes.
Thank you, Leah. We have time for another round of questions. The microphone is there, so let's take that one. But any other, I'm going to collect up a couple of others. I'm trying to look around the room. Lady here as well, and one more. You're looking at the ceiling.
There's one in the front door, too.
Any more questions? Just see where. Do we? Oh, sorry, I was. Apologize.
Thank you. I'm Melissa Rubio from University of Cologne. So you were talking about that the second generation is the one that rises, and I was wondering how much is that about assimilation, and that they already probably got American names, and they also look more American if parents married other Americans, and now there is a clear definition of an American group, because Europeans, for Europeans probably it's easier to pass as Americans as if there is another group that is harder to pass on as part of being American. Thank you.
Thank you. And then we'll go back again to lady here.
Hello, thanks. Sandra McNally, University of Surrey. When it comes to understanding hostility to immigration in the UK, sometimes it's about the idea that there's too many people for the fixed supply of housing and for fixed public services, education and health. And I wondered whether this was something that you've been able to look at, or do you think that that might be driving some of the sentiment in the US as well?
It's a very familiar argument, Sandra. And the third question at the front. Isn't there a shortage of microphones? Just here. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That was great. Lindsay Macmillan from UCL. 1960 came up a lot throughout everything. And do you have many hypotheses about what kind of changed at that point? Was it the role of media and the television? Did that play an important role in communication? And you know, we've seen a rise in social media and the polarization of opinion driven by that. Did TV's introduction to political debates in the 60s play a role potentially, or is that something you can look at?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nat King Cole. So
Okay.
we'll again, you heard the questions, you just answer them in any way you wish.
So on the question of cultural assimilation in the second generation, so the one piece of data we've looked at on this point suggests probably not, but I mean, it's limited. So what we've done is we have looked at pairs of siblings who are given very differently ethnic first names. So one child is named Giuseppe and the other then is named David. And then they go out into the labor market. So we see them in the same household in childhood, and then we can follow them. And there are a number of audit studies that suggest that if you have a foreign name, that might be holding you back, and you get fewer calls from employers. But this is now real labor market data, and we find that in the cross-section, Giuseppe's and David's look very different, but that seems to be because they're coming from different families. Once we're looking at brothers who have different names, it doesn't seem like they're being treated differently in the labor market historically. So this is not modern data. And so that suggests that some of the simple versions of what it means to be culturally assimilated might not be what's going on. If I had to guess, it has to do with being educated in the US, primarily public school system, rather than the degree of cultural assimilation, at least historically. On the question about too many people and services, I actually think that this is incredibly important and gets left out of many economic discussions among economists, but certainly it's in the public. It got me thinking in talking about the book this summer during a period where inflation was increasingly on people's minds. There are hundreds of studies looking at the association between immigrant arrivals and wages, and they don't find much. But there's only a few studies focusing on immigrant arrivals and housing prices. Using the same research design, and I'm thinking about the work of Albert Saez, and he does find that when immigrants arrive in an area, housing prices go up in the US. And this is a policy choice, because we certainly could build more housing when more population arrives. But if we're not going to build more housing, then the association that people have in their mind between immigrants arrive in my local area, my area gets crowded, there's traffic, housing prices go up, does seem to be borne out in the data. So are we talking too much about wages and not enough about prices, local prices maybe? That might be on people's minds, and there could be something real there when we have policy solutions for that. And finally, 1960. So I think what's going on in terms of immigration policy history is that 1965 is the border reopening. And doesn't reopen completely, so not back to a world of open immigration, but the immigration quota that had been set as of 1921 was trebled, and the restrictions on particular countries of origin were eliminated. And so we have a very different set of sending country backgrounds from 65 and onward. And so when we see 60 or 70 as the period where immigrants start to pull away from the US born, I think it has to do with this changing composition. And my understanding of the historical narrative, but we're going to dive into it more over the summer, is that the Cold War played an important role in that switch. And in fact, politicians at the time said, don't worry. Yes, we're increasing the number of immigrants, but we're still going to have immigrants from Europe almost exclusively, because we're imposing something new and exciting, family reunification. So the easiest way to get into the US now will be if you already have a family member in the US. And who had family members in the US as of 1965? Primarily Italians, Portuguese, Poles, and not as many in terms of Asian or Latin American, but there were a few, and family reunification just creates immigrant multipliers, which were not on the minds of politicians at the time. So I think that's not at all why they chose to open the border, and this was a very unintended consequence.
Thank you very much, Leah. Well, I've learned over many years of experience the most dangerous thing you can do in life is keep economists away from their drinks. It's just gone 5:45, and we've got to cross town, I think, for these drinks, by which time we'll be so thirsty we may not make it. So I think we have to draw the session to a close. Leah, I've listened with great fascination to your work this afternoon. I've enjoyed it, and I will certainly spend more time reading it. And one thing that struck me is how much overlap there might be, without us realizing it, with the European and British experience. In fact, the very titles of your two books, The Promised Land and Streets of Gold, are phrases used in Europe and in Britain very often about from immigrant backgrounds as well. So I think we have much to learn from you, but if we could also encourage you to work on Britain and Europe, that all the better. And ultimately, if we can change the minds of some of our politicians and remind them that even people like Frank Hahn once came over to this country in a small boat, we can probably end up with much better policy. Leah, thank you ever so much for the lecture today.